Alright guys, the video for today is going to be about this incident that occurred in San Antonio, Texas on June 23rd, 2023, where police officers from the San Antonio Police Department responded to a call of felony vandalism, ended up shooting a woman who was suffering from mental illness. She was inside her home and they shot and killed her. Those three officers were arrested and charged with murder. That's what today's video is going to be about. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about most likely what was going through those officers' heads when they were trying to do what they were trying to do, and how it went wrong, why they were wrong, and look at ways that we can prevent incidents like this from happening in the future. All right, guys, I think the best way to kind of get into this story is just kind of read the news article. And then what we're going to do is we're going to watch some of the body camera footage, and I'm going to kind of walk you through it piece by piece and give you my opinion on what was going on and kind of how we can fix this stuff from happening. In my opinion, an incident like this is something that will be used as a training tool for police officers for years to come. This is the kind of thing that I would generally see at my annual in-service training when I go for my legal updates and that sort of thing. You know, you can teach police officers a lot by showing them the right thing to do, and you can give them all the tools and tell them what you're supposed to do in the right situation. But honestly, the best way that we learn as police officers, this seems to be the way police training is directed over the years, is that you show a group of police officers that did not do the right thing and you explain how they could have done it properly. And that's kind of how we're going to look at this incident today. So I already went over the headline. Let's get into the story. It says 3 San Antonio police officers were charged with murder on Friday, less than 24 hours after they fatally shot a woman during a police call. These are the officers' names. I'm not good at reading Hispanic names. They are suspended from the force without pay as the investigation continues. All were released on $100,000 bond. Then here's a statement from the chief, which I agree to a large degree. I think is a very well written statement and really well thought out. The officers' actions were not consistent with policies and training. They placed themselves in a situation where they used deadly force, which was not reasonable given all the circumstances as we now understand them. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Some of the main issues that I want to focus on when I'm going through this incident, I wrote them down. The first issue that I saw when I watched this video is subject control of the scene. The second thing is I want to talk about the concept of fresh pursuit. And then we're going to talk about the reasonableness standard in Graham versus Connor and the standard that is used when evaluating the level of force that a police officer uses and whether or not it's appropriate. I suppose the best way to do that is just to get right into the video. And what I have done with this video is I took it directly from police activity and then I edited it down. I removed the parts where the officers are actually firing their weapons because they did shoot and kill this woman during this event. That would make this video age restricted, which also limits the amount of people that will see this video. I want as many people to be able to see this video as possible, so I edited it in this particular way. If you want to watch the entire video, go to police activity. It's only 2.5 minutes. If you want, you can pause this video, go over there, watch it, and then come back, and then I'll walk you through the parts that I think are most important. So here we have, it looks like officers have already been on, and the video that was released is already highly redacted and highly edited. So it's a little bit hard to follow, but I'm going to do my best to kind of walk you through what I believe is happening. So the video starts off with an officer walking up to the female suspect. Looks like the officers have already been on scene for some period of time. I don't know if they're just milling around trying to decide what level of crime they have, whether or not she's going to be arrested on the scene, if they're going to issue warrants, or if they're just going to take a report and leave. That might be what's going on, but she is definitely the suspect, the person of interest. She is not free to go. When the officer approaches her, she decides that she wants to leave.
Hey, lady, get over here. Get over here.
Alrighty, so that is the first point that I want to bring up, and I've done this in videos before. This is something that we as officers have to keep in mind, and I think it's also something that's important for the public to keep in mind, that subject control and scene control are very important aspects of police work. This is a situation where I know what these officers were thinking. They were thinking, hey, this woman is suffering from some kind of mental illness, some kind of delusions. There's something not right with her. We don't want to put our hands on her if we can avoid it. We want her to feel comfortable. We want to kind of keep our distance and just make everybody feel nice and relaxed. So that's what they were doing. She then decides that she doesn't want to be there anymore, takes off. Unfortunately, her taking off and the officers not controlling her is what leads up to everything else. If an officer had grabbed onto her and she tried to pull away and they armbarred her to the ground, or they tackled her to the ground, she might have had a minor injury. She might have hit her head. She might have broke her arm. Some of those things could have potentially happened. It also might have looked bad if there's onlookers. If people are standing around watching and they say that officer tackled that woman who was just walking her dog, that she was doing nothing wrong. That's the kind of stuff that happens in these cases. But had they done that, she would still be alive today. And I want to make sure that I stress that to people, that sometimes when a person is not yet charged with a crime, there is not necessarily proof that they have committed a crime, but there is probable cause to believe they did, or at least reasonable suspicion that crime is afoot. That person can be detained, and an officer is authorized to use force in order to detain that person. Police officers in this day and age are a little bit too reluctant to use force in some of those situations. And unfortunately, I've seen it time and time again that the officer's reluctance to use force initially led to a circumstance where the situation escalated into a deadly force encounter. That's what happens today. And it's probably one of the most unfortunate parts about this entire incident. So they basically let her go. They chased after her. She ran into her apartment, shut the door. The officer that ran to the front door was unable to get in. So now we have officers who ran to the back door. We're going to get into the fresh pursuit argument with this. I'll go over fresh pursuit in a second, but here is the officer that ran to the back door to try to head her off.
You're gonna get shot!
Shoot me! You're not gonna work!
Door!
No!
Hey!
Alrighty, so the first part of the video, the officer was definitely in fresh pursuit. Woman was being detained. She tried to leave. He chased after her. That is fresh pursuit. The next officer that goes to the back door, I think there is an argument to be made. It's not one that I agree with, but I do believe that there's a legal argument to be made that he was still in fresh pursuit of a suspect. He was making sure that she didn't square out the back, stuff like that. Let's get into, I've gone ahead and pulled this up because I don't think the general public is aware of this concept of fresh pursuit. So I brought it up. This is from Cornell Law School. It says fresh pursuit, also known as hot pursuit or immediate pursuit, means that police officers have the right to conduct a continuous pursuit beyond their jurisdiction in order to apprehend a suspect. That means that if I'm in my jurisdiction and I light up a car, the car takes off and leaves my jurisdiction, constitutionally, I am allowed to leave my jurisdiction to affect that arrest because the crime actually occurred in my jurisdiction. That's what fresh pursuit means in that context. And it says it also refers to the Fourth Amendment clause, allowing police officers to conduct a warrantless search and arrest while pursuing a fleeing suspect. Fresh pursuit can also be the right of a person to use reasonable force to retake property that has just been taken. So this is the context that I want to talk about today, where it says fresh pursuit also refers to the Fourth Amendment clause allowing police officers to conduct a warrantless search and arrest while pursuing a fleeing suspect. What this means is that if I'm a police officer and you're the suspect and we're a block away from your house, If you take off, you get a jump on me, you're 15 yards ahead of me. You're running down the street, you turn up the sidewalk, you go in your house, you run inside, you shut the door. You can't just say, look, I'm on home base. This is my house. The Fourth Amendment protects me from being arrested. You have to go get a warrant, yada, yada, yada. If I am in fresh pursuit, hot pursuit, I'm right on your heels. You run your house and slam that door on me. Even if you hit the deadbolt, if I'm strong enough and I can barrel through that door, I have permission under the Constitution, under the Fourth Amendment, to make a warrantless entry into your house to effect that arrest. That is what fresh pursuit is. Now, where that is interpreted by the courts is a little bit squishy, and there's a lot of judgment calls that come into that. If you are running after somebody, they shut the door on you, you're unable to get in the door, you have to run to the back door, you then force your way through the back door, the courts generally have ruled that that is no longer fresh pursuit. In a situation like this, where the first officer was running, chasing her through the front door, she locks the front door, he's unable to get in. If another officer is simultaneously, if the guy out front says, hey, she's going in the front door, and there happens to be out back, and he's able to quickly gain entry into that house while she is actively fleeing, I can see a circumstance where a judge might allow that. Although it's dicey, and I think that you're gambling when you're in that situation. So we saw that officer go to the back door. He tried the back door. He tried to get in the window. She threatened to hit him with a hammer. He threatened to shoot her. He then backed out. The moment that he gave up that ground and backed out, you 100% lost your fresh pursuit argument. The argument that we have to make a warrantless entry into this house to apprehend a suspect. Because now you have a situation where the officers are all just standing around in the backyard. They're coming up with a plan on how to arrest this person. I didn't mention it in the beginning, but the crime that she committed was she was destroying or damaging, cutting wires on a fire alarm system for the apartment complex. This was deemed to be felony vandalism in the state of Texas. So they have a fresh felony that they are trying to apprehend, a fresh felon that they're trying to apprehend. The problem is, at this point, once you try to get in the house and you fail and you back out, you need to get a warrant for what you're going to do. So the problem is, every single thing that they do from this point on is now illegal in the eyes of the court. Every single step that they take from here on out is a violation of this woman's rights. So while they were violating her rights, they ended up also shooting and killing her, which puts them in the trick bag. That's why they got charged with homicide. I hope that explanation, I hope you guys understand kind of that explanation. So, but I would also argue that if, I need to step back for a moment once again, because if you're chasing after a suspect, they go to the door, they shut the door behind them, you kick that door, you're like bang, bang, bang right behind them. They go into the house, they grab a hammer, and you're on them. You're fresh pursuit, you're right behind them, they grab a hammer, they turn to hit you with a hammer, you draw your weapon and shoot that person. That is going to be deemed a reasonable use of force because you were legally occupying the space that you were in. You had a legal justified reason for being in that house. They threatened you with a deadly weapon. You had to defend yourself with deadly force. The woman in this house arms herself with a weapon, stays inside her house. The officers are in a second here are going to try to get into that house. That's what the chief was saying when he said they put themselves in a situation unnecessarily where they were forced to use deadly weapons when they didn't have to. This situation right here, what they have is you have to get a warrant. You know where the person is. You might even know their name. You can get a search warrant. If you don't know this woman's name, you can get a search warrant. You can say, look, I'm at 123 South 5th Street. There's a suspect that ran into this apartment. We watched her run in the apartment. We're looking in the windows. We can see that she's still there. We have the house surrounded. We don't know her name. We need a search warrant so we can go in and find this suspect. A judge is going to sign that warrant all day long. If you do know her name, then you go ahead and you file your felony vandalism charge. File a felony vandalism charge. You put her address on the warrant. If you have an arrest warrant and it's written to the address where the suspect is currently residing, you can force entry into that residence in order to apprehend that suspect. That's That's how arrest warrants work. That is what the officers should have done. It's not what they did.
Hold on.
You ain't got no warrant.
Let's go.
The really sad part about this is that the woman, even though she's in an excited mental state, she's correct. So you see the officers waited for a period of time, and then they tried to go back in. You can tell that they waited for a period of time because the screen is already on the ground. So the officer that went up, pulled the screen off, had retreated. Once you retreat, you lose that ground. There's nothing wrong with staying outside and waiting.
Let's go. Move. Go. Hey, watch out.
So it happened very quick. Again, I removed the shooting. I'm sorry, but it happened just like that. The woman came to the door with a hammer and I think she started breaking windows with the hammer, and then the officers opened fire on the woman. She was not struck by the original volley of fire. This is a shot of her retreating back into her apartment. I've got this on video here in a second. And then when she comes back, the officers are going to open fire on her once again. So instead of showing the shooting, I've got still shots of the shooting that occurred. Now we're going to talk about the reasonableness standard. And I've got a couple web pages that I pulled up for that. This is Justia Law. I refer to this web page a lot. This is Graham versus Connor. This is the landmark use of force case that police officers are judged against whenever they have a use of force, whether it be a low-level use of force or something like deadly force. It says, claims of excessive force by law enforcement during arrest, stop, or other seizure of an individual is the subject of the objective reasonableness standard of the Fourth Amendment, rather than a substance due process standard under the Fourth Amendment. In other words, the facts and circumstances related to the use of force drive the analysis, rather than any improper intent or motivation by the officers who use the force. So this is the argument that a lot of people don't understand. And it's the thing that a lot of people will say is, oh, I get that he was resisting arrest, but that doesn't mean he needed to die. What they're doing is they're confusing the objectively reasonable standard versus the substantive due process. When officers have a use of force against a person, they're using force to effect an arrest. They're using force to protect themselves. They're using the amount of force that is required for the situation. They are not trying to punish the person. If you use force in order to punish somebody, that is a violation of their due process. People confuse that a lot. It's not, okay, I realize that he had a gun and he was running away. That doesn't mean he needed to die. That would be that the officers violated his due process. But is it objectively reasonable for an officer to believe that a suspect who is running from them in possession of a firearm might turn and use that firearm on the officers? Yes, that is objectively reasonable, because we can bring up video after video after video of suspects who are running from an officer and either just whip that gun behind him and shoot the officer, or post up around a corner, sit in an ambush position and shoot the officer. That's the difference between objectively reasonable and due process. I also brought up a definition of objectively reasonable. I thought this was it's a slightly better definition of objectively reasonable. It says use of force cases often come down to whether actions were objectively reasonable. Courts view factors like the severity of the crime, the threat posed by the suspect, and whether the suspect was trying to escape. These factors often help determine whether whether a reasonable officer would have acted in the same way. That is the key line. Would a reasonable officer have acted in the same way? Let's go back to this situation here. We have a woman. The crime that she committed was a felony vandalism crime. She ran into her apartment and was for lack of a better term, barricaded inside her apartment with a hammer. So that's the crime. That's what she's doing. She wasn't actively pursuing the officers. She wasn't a direct threat to the officers. She wasn't even trying to get away from the officers. A reasonable officer would have thought, you know what, we're going to surround this apartment. We're going to wait for her. We're going to get the charges. We're going to get the warrant. We're going to do all those things. These officers didn't do that. They tried to force the issue. They tried to get into her house. Then you look at the actual use of force that occurred. She was still inside her house. They were outside of her house. There is a 5-pronged test that we use in my agency that we're trained when it comes to using non-lethal force during a lethal force engagement. These are situations where someone might have a club, a hammer, a knife, a sword, an axe, all of these kind of things. And the officers want to try to apprehend that person using non-lethal force, usually a taser. The rules for when we are going to use non-lethal force versus lethal force are whether or not you have time, distance, barrier, availability of other options, and there's another one that's slipping my mind right now. Oh, and whether or not the use of force is reasonable. So this is a situation where she was inside her house with a hammer. The officers were outside of the house with a glass door, and this officer right here on the left has a giant wood, maybe brick behind it, panel in front of him. She's inside with a hammer. They are outside. They had time. They had distance. She could not reach them with the hammer. They had a barrier, a physical barrier. They had other options available, and then we're going to get into whether or not this was reasonable. This is why the officers were charged. Briefly, I saw some people commenting on this guy here saying, that he was shooting with his eyes closed. That may or may not be true. It's hard to tell if he has his dominant eye open or not. But I still find it hard to believe that where his position was actually directly behind this glass door. I don't believe he was acting to protect his life or the life of his fellow officers by shooting at her through the door the way he shot. This officer here is literally firing into the wall. He's not aiming at his target. He cannot see the suspect at the time. There is no way that this is an objectively reasonable use of force. I think I've covered all the points that I want to cover, and I hope you understand kind of what was going through their heads, what they thought they were doing, but you understand why they were wrong in thinking that way. That's the big thing that I want to get across here, because again, one of the biggest reasons that we watch videos like this and we study incidents like this is so that we know not to do this kind of thing in the future. At the end of the day, this is an incredibly sad situation. It's really sad that 3 officers are now fired and they're on trial for their lives. They made a series of poor decisions that put them in that situation. And it's sad regardless. I don't know these guys' history. They might have been great guys that made a very, very, very bad decision on this night, and it literally ruined their lives. But most importantly, we have a woman who is dead. Ms. Perez is no longer alive because these guys made a very poor decision, a series of very poor decisions. Ms. Perez also had a 9-year-old daughter who no longer has a mother because these officers made a bad decision. This kind of stuff cannot be happening. We have to do everything we can to make sure that this kind of thing doesn't happen again. That's the reason that these guys were arrested and charged with murder. I think that's all I'm going to say today. Thank you for watching. I'll talk to you later.